You speaking from beyond the grave. Have I got the right screen up on for the Zoom, guys? Or do I need to swap it over?
Why are we going to close caption?
Yeah, I know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I wasn't sure where to pitch it, whether to do, just talk about the program or put some of the theory. And I decided that it was hard to discuss this without understanding the background. So at the moment, or last week, there was a big UN Biodiversity Conference in China, I think, and they've agreed, or they're talking about putting 30% of the planet under protection by 2030. The problem is that at least 37% of that land is indigenous communities, and they haven't asked them. So there's issues there, and that's indigenous land, that's indigenous people. Then there's also communal people. So maybe 70% of that area doesn't belong to them. So for me, that's the really interesting, how do we conserve the planet? And we're really dealing with the planetary boundaries and the failure of land use systems in forests and drylands and biodiversity. So these are all common property problems if you look at them. So how do we solve the common property problems in many of where our communities live and there's wildlife and so on? So one of the issues is sorry, this always changes every time you use it, is we're using an exclusionary conservation model, and I'll explain what that is and why it's problematic. And I find it's really useful to go way back in the history and understand where these come from, because then you understand why they're not so normal. So what we've had back in the day, we had these local systems of resource management, including things like the HIMA system, which is written into Arabic law and Sharia law. And that's essentially a community-based program which talks about ecosystem services, written by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, about 1400 years ago. Then we have the rise of the Western world and the development of exclusionary conservation, with the big events being William the Conqueror and Roosevelt and the London Convention, which I'll briefly summarize. And now we've got inclusive conservation emerging again, kind of this thing being repeated. And I'll explain that and why it's important. So where did conservation law and norms, institutions come from?
Sorry, can't see your hand.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
Hands on.
So when William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, what he basically did, he made Robin Hood's lifestyle illegal. So Robin Hood then became a poacher because the king claimed ownership of the forests and the wildlife, etc. And so then Robin Hood had to rob the rich and he became a criminal. So this guy living his lifestyle became a criminal. If you fast forward nearly 1,000 years and you look what happened with Western European emergence from the Industrial Revolution, essentially the same thing happened. Look at this country. We had bison and beavers and all sorts of things under local systems. The Europeans came and they broke down the local systems. They broke down the store. And then everyone rushed in and grabbed all the resources out the store, and they blamed the market. They didn't blame the destruction of the local system. They blamed the market. And the market's being blamed, is even being blamed today for the disappearance of rhino and elephant. But in my opinion, that's wrong. What they didn't blame was the destruction of the breaking down of the store. They're never thinking about that. If the store's open, everyone's rushing in. They ban shopping. They don't ban stealing. And so we ended up with this conservation based on no commercial use and central ownership by the state and protected areas. And that was then exported through Europe because Roosevelt was a good friend of the Brits, and he was part of the Flora and Fauna International Society. And that was sent to Africa, and the legislation is almost identical. And we ended up with two models. The Yellowstone model of exclusionary protected area conservation and the North American model of hunting. In America, it's really evolved, but when it's exported, it's caricatured. and it's sent out pure through IUCN, etc. And it's not been very successful. Wildlife is essentially, we've lost 75% of vertebrate fauna in the last 60 years or 50 years, because we basically are asking people on private and community land to produce and look after public good. So you've got a mismatch between public goods and private land and production. So in Southern Africa, they started to challenge that and develop some ideas towards inclusionary conservation. So essentially, land was settled for agriculture. They found out that these are the number of species, of wild species and domestic species. They figured out that, well, maybe the system should be managed, is complex and should be managed in a complex way. And so they changed the legislation and they gave the ownership back to the farmers. And they said, you maximize the value of your wildlife, because if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And consequently, wildlife proved to be wildlife's a complicated system. You develop meat, hunting, tourism, and that converts grass into livelihoods better than just simple meat systems. So essentially, wildlife allowed this, and wildlife started to outcompete domestic species or typical domestic crops and animals. If you look at that as an experiment, so here's your policy business as usual. Here's Kenya, a decline in cattle by 9%, a decline in wildlife by 67%, but an increase in livestock generally because of range degradation. The cattle ate all the grass, and so it's replaced by camels, goats, etc. Whereas in Southern Africa, you get the wildlife increasing about 600% from a low base, and cattle farming switching into wildlife because it's more profitable. And this is basically a policy experiment based on the devolution of rights and the development of markets. So it's the opposite of exclusionary conservation. Just I put this in, I can't help this. So the whole debate at global level is markets are bad, markets are bad. So there's only one species in Kenya. This is a change in Kenyan populations of domestic herbivores and wild herbivores since 1970. Only one wild herbivore is traded in the global marketplace, and that's that one. Yet the obsession is with global trade. So that's just to say, I think that they're not thinking about the destruction of the institutions that control wildlife. They're obsessed by markets and trade and money and dollarization and hechechi and all that sort of thing. So what you have now in Southern Africa, this is data from Namibia, is the livestock increased at the expense of wildlife to about 6 million animals. Wildlife declined to about 500,000, and now it's increased to 3 million again at the expense of cattle. So that changed when they changed the policy to, on private land, they gave the ownership in 1967, and then communities of 1997. And that's flipped. So you have a kind of a regional policy experiment. So this is the data from South Africa. That's the value of livestock per hectare. And wildlife is out-competing it, and therefore is taking up 20% of the landscape. But what for me is interesting is that there's a huge amount of variability in the wildlife production. So why are we producing here? Could we produce there? And so on. People always talk about ecotourism. So if you're in the right place next to Kruger, you're earning $500 per hectare. But if you're out in the Karoo, it doesn't make money. So ecotourism is not a replacement for hunting tourism, live game products, etc. This is a mixed game ranch that uses wildlife primarily for hunting, but for other purposes. So that's the first thing. Putting wildlife back in the marketplaces, creating ownership's been important. But I think what we've learned in the last 40 years, we've learned a lot about ownership of wildlife, what we call proprietorship. So here's a picture of the ecological misfit. We're taking simple systems and we're trying to put them in complex environments, either in forests or drylands. They're not working that well. So the biologists think like that. So I'm an institutional economist. I think more about the laws and do they fit? And equally, they don't. So here's where civilization emerged, some of it. in the Nile Delta or Syria and so on. And what you have here is a foundation of tenurial institutions 5,000 years ago. So you have simple square property rights, cadasters, simple ownership of wildlife. So very simple ownership systems. If you look where humans evolved, they evolved in these, basically the Babylon centers where you have below, the Yellow River, the big deltas in South Asia, Mesopotamia, and so on. And what you got here is a graph from desert to good agricultural land to forest. So essentially the majority, of course, they're hunter-gatherers in forests and hunter-gatherers in drylands, but agriculture tended to evolve in what I call the farming or agricultural sweet spot. In terms of institutions, cadasters work really easily, where you can draw a square thing and nothing's moving, and the ecosystem's simple. The old Egyptian style system is still being applied 5,000 years later, and it still works. But when you move into the complex systems, it doesn't work because your cattle are moving, your pastoralists are moving, your forests are complicated, your rubber tappers move in circles, so the system doesn't work. So how do we adapt to that? So because they couldn't adapt to this, they just said wildlife is public, it's owned by everybody. And that's not correct conceptually. The two points. Firstly, what is wildlife? When we talk about wildlife, we talk about elephants, we talk about squirrels, or we talk about monkeys. So wildlife is a complicated good. Secondly, and I won't get into this too much, but we've got Ostrom talking about, you've got private goods, you've got public goods, and you've got common pool assets. So if you look at that theoretically, wildlife is essentially a complicated good, which is largely private because it's excludable and rivalrous, which means a public good is like standing under a lamp in the street. It doesn't get used up, and the fact that I'm standing there doesn't detract from you. But if I use an elephant, I'm detracting from you, and I can also exclude you from using my elephant. So an elephant's not a public good. It's more a private good with some common pool properties that also provides public benefits. It's not a public good, it provides public benefits. So you've got a complicated good with three components: complex private good, common pool properties, and provides global good. So if it's a three-tier system, why do we apply three-tier tenure to it? Three-tier institutions, which is what we're kind of doing in Southern Africa in some places. So the ownership of the wildlife is privatized, so you own the elephant. But if the elephant moves outside your farm, there's a collective action mechanism, so you can manage the externalities of that elephant. So you're managing more at scale. And then the state has a role of designing the rights, extension, and if you mess up. So what you're doing here is you're matching more complicated institutions to more complicated resources. So if you look at land, labor, and capital over time, banking's got much more sophisticated, education's got sophisticated. Land, natural resource, we're using the same institutions we used 5,000 years ago. So no wonder they don't work. So that's the one thing we're kind of working on. And we need to design these systems to try and get to 3030. The second thing is the value of wildlife. So it's been taken out the marketplace. In Southern Africa, we put it back because our assumption was that wildlife had a comparative advantage in dry areas, was more profitable than livestock, which is true. So that's the same curve. Once you get to farming areas, corn's more profitable, or tobacco. Amazon environment must be tobacco. But in these dry areas, wildlife is economically more profitable. But we have a set of market failures. So we have this exclusionary conservation says you're not allowed to use wildlife. You're not allowed to trade wildlife. There's thousands of regulations when you're concerned with wildlife. And in addition to that, let's subsidize the cows. And so the financial price is wildlife is not very profitable. And so therefore gets replaced. So what we've essentially done in Southern Africa is taken out these market failures and fixed them. by giving the ownership back, allowing trade, encouraging trade as much as possible, and fixing the regulations so they're simple. And that's pushed the curve up, and you'll see the wildlife areas expanded. It's a fairly simple economic theory. So that's what we call the price and proprietorship foundations of what, let me call it, inclusionary conservation. Shifting to communities, I'll slow down when I get to the end there. Most of Africa, when we're doing this 30 by 30 or half Earth or whatever we do, the majority of the expansion of conservation areas is going to be where people live. Even the expansion of protected areas has been so successful, going from 9% to 17% over the last 30 years. That's all been in category 5 and category 6 IUCN protected areas, which is where people live. So we haven't actually increased category 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is standard national parks. We've hardly increased them at all. The expansion has been in sustainable use areas. So Leandro, you'll probably recognize some of this. Or when we started looking at communities in Southern Africa, we were quite surprised because firstly we found, do you trust your leaders with money? No. Do you trust each other with money? No. Are you organized to do business? Yeah, we organized traditionally and with the church. But when it comes to economic activities, there's almost no organizational scale. And so for me, that's a highly socially decapitalized community. Where's the social? That's completely different to Norway. So you've lost your trust, you've lost your organization. And so thank you for making me teach that Africa class. But what I've learned is that these communities are, the other thing I asked, why are African communities scattered across the environment? Whereas if you go to England, people live in villages, or you go to Vietnam, people live in villages. And in countries like Botswana, where there's been no trauma, people live in villages. But if you go to Zambia or Mozambique, where there's been a lot of slave trade, people are scattered everywhere. So what I'm thinking is that Africans have suffered 400 or 500 years. You can look at the social structures of civilizations going from 4 major civilizations to a lot of like warlord civilizations between 1500 and 1800. And so I think there's a fair amount of evidence, but not many people are writing about it, is that we had slavery. Now, slavery was pretty bad going across here, but who was catching the slaves? And something like you had a slaving event in a village once every 10 or 15 years. And the slavers were basically the African warlords who then became the chiefs, because the African commerce was based on people for many years. So the rich people, the powerful people, had made their money out of commerce and people. When the colonials come in, how do they control the people? They use the same warlords. When the Marxists or the socialist governments come in, how do they control the people? Through the same system. And so, and when you get corruption, how do you control the system? Well, through the same personalized chief-based system. And so essentially, that is why I think we don't have rural people have lost their dignity. Secondly, you can't extract things from people when they own it. So the colonials particularly didn't allow property rights to evolve in Africa. They were evolving in South Africa, and the property rights were closed, because if people have got good property, they're going to farm and they're not going to work on the mines. And if you are doing a gold mine or a diamond mine, you need cheap labor. And cheap labor only comes from places where there's no property. And so Asamoah and Robinson have got a big section in their book about that. So essentially the property rights have been changed, and Africa still, I call it a deinstitutionalized space. There's no property rights, there's no organization. You're essentially living in a situation like the European Dark Ages, where there's lords who have property and serfs who don't, or slaves who don't. And so all these people living in the marginal areas are very much disenfranchised people who have no rights. They don't have rights to life, liberty, and property, like John Locke said. That's what development's built on. So we have to fix that if we're going to conserve the wildlife. Sorry, I said that already. So community conservation is is not so much a process of conserving wildlife, it's a process of rebuilding society. Because in my view, well-managed communities are not going to let their resources. Why would they mess up their own resources? And I'm going to talk mainly about this one, but essentially what we do is we turn the wildlife into benefits. And we have to make the benefits go from central government to the community. The community then manages the benefits through governance, which is, I guess, my speciality. And Tierney also, that's what her thesis was on. And once they're benefiting and they're organized, they manage the resources. But how do we do this when people are so traumatized with no social capital? I'm going to skip the next two slides because they. So what we've done, and I'm putting it really simply here, is we put the cash on the table. And then we involve the whole community in what we call participatory activity-based budgeting. They sit around for days and days, and they figure out how to use their money. And they're each an equal shareholder in the dividend in the village company. And so we build their structure, and through this process, not so much about money, the process about using that to set up proper organization, like a town hall government in some ways, a village company or something. And I'll show you some pictures of how it builds up self-confidence. And it's also now that the guy's getting cash, you realize wildlife's valuable, so wildlife can start to compete against livestock in the marketplace. So you'll see the community start using their cash. I'll take some cash as some of the benefits as cash. This woman's bought sugar, and that's important. And in a drought, getting food is really important. But they'll also engage in social activity. So they'll tax themselves in some ways. They get the dividend and they sit down and they impose a tax on themselves because these guys need a school, and these guys need a clinic, and these guys need a clean water because they get cholera. So they're now making economic decisions on their own, and that's building the capacity. And they do all sorts of things. So here you can see the old school and the new school. But probably the most important thing, these guys are here. I met them. They built the school, and they built the house for the teacher. And yeah, they built the house, but the most important thing is they've done it themselves. And you can see that they're really proud. They lined up, you have to take a photograph of us because we've done this. The first thing we ever did. When you first came to speak to us, we told you we were lazy and drunk, which they did because they were disenfranchised. And now we lazy, drunk people are able to do this. So you're building social capital. And this is another example of a clinic that the government was fussing over and the NGO was fussing over for years. As soon as the community got their money, they built it. So what you're doing is you're building that social capacity. And then, of course, people protect the wildlife. They put in dams and they do anti-poaching. What's interesting to me, and this is Mangalana, if you look at how quickly social if it's a system's this isn't even a great system, to be honest, but the community's slightly organized, they're getting money generally on time, and not all of it's being stolen. What you can see is in 4 years, they've gone from seeing wildlife as only important. 4 out of 5 people say it's not important, to 80% people saying wildlife's important. You can see participation has gone from almost 0 to 80%. You can see the relationship with the protected area has increased from low to high. And you can see people saying they poach less. So that's quite quick. If you monitor these, and I couldn't find the actual slide, but in one of these communities that the money went missing, and you can see that the curve goes bloop. So quickly you can see the social capacity is going down again. So you can build this capacity. And what we're finding is that if you go into Africa, everyone just sees black people everywhere. But how do you organize them? So what we're figuring out is we essentially organize them at village level. This is called participatory governance level, where everybody sits around and decides for themselves. And this is a representation level where he's elected or she's elected and they form a committee. The performance of these levels is way higher than the performance of that level. but all the donors are doing this. So Tierney analyzed Shylock and Patricia's data on a whole bunch of variables here. So do you have the right to remove people who are not in the committee that are not doing properly? Have you got a right to vote? Do you have the right to check the money? Can you name the chair? And the picture's pretty similar wherever you go. Gray is a single village and orange is a multi-village. So whether you're in Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, one other, Namibia maybe, single villages outperform. And that's a Likert scale. So if you get that difference on a Likert scale, consistently it's quite high. So we're promoting this idea called village-based governance. Zimbabwe yesterday, the minister said, instead of working at this level, at the council level, they gave appropriate authority to what's the district council. So none of the money, half the money only was getting to communities. They're just in the process of changing the legislation. So every village has almost title to its wildlife. And that gives us a really interesting place to experiment to see how this capital changes. So things are changing even as we speak. And if you look at, here's the Namibian program in summary. This is the amount of donor money that they've got, up to $10 million a year. So it's a lot of money. But this is the economic return on investment. So it takes you about 10 or 15 years to get the communities organized. And once they're organized, the return on investment high. But how many donor projects are 5 years or 3 years? So most donors fiddle around here, say, oh, we've spent so much money, let's go to the next project, instead of sticking around and investing in it. So that just shows you that the return on investment can be fairly high. So, Mike, I'm sure you've seen this. This is the density of large mammals around the world, and the only place that still has Pleistocene wildlife is Africa, because hunter-gatherers, when they went out, whenever they arrived in America, it was 12 or 14 or 16 or 18,000 years ago, they essentially wiped out the Pleistocene wildlife. As I always say to my class, go to the Florida Museum and see what Gainesville was like 10,000 years ago. There was a lot of wildlife around here. So we have an asset that nobody else has. One of our problems, though, is because of this obsession with no markets, our asset has been greatly compromised. So if you look at Southern Africa, rhino horn and ivory is potentially worth $1 billion a year, even at a decent price, which will give the landholders $500 million, but we're not allowed to trade that. Trophy hunting is worth $500 million, of which 200 million gets to the landholders. But I put that target there because the animal writers every day are trying to close this market. Ecotourism is worth about 1 or 2 billion, but Alex's research showed that only 4.5% of that actually goes back into management of Kruger and the reserves. So if you calculate that out, that's only paying 550 to 100 million for land management. So what we have is a lot of pressure to close our market, saying these are public goods, they're global benefits and so on. But WWF in Namibia just did an experiment to look at willingness to pay and could they set up wildlife credits. No one's prepared to provide any money. So you're getting a problem that the wildlife economy is being squeezed by external pressures. So now let's go back to the 30% by 2030. And why I think this is, the timing is important right now, and then I'll get into the education side. So exclusionary conservation, which I explained, led to a 75% decline in herbivores. Not only exclusionary conservation, but its inability to conserve wildlife. Little experiment in Southern Africa, which tries inclusive conservation. You have similar results in Nepal and in some of the extractive and indigenous reserves in Latin America and the Ijitos in Mexico and so on. But the local ownership often brings the wildlife back. However, what you have is that these people, as the markets get closed, they become dependent on the big aid agencies and particularly the big NGOs. The big NGOs are brought up on this philosophy. So they then reimpose the original system that wasn't working. And I mean, I've looked at some of these projects and they spend 60 billion. One project I saw, they spent $60 million. There's no measurable impact. The manager's package was $500,000 a year. So that's how much money they're throwing, yet our poor communities have got nothing. So because of the lack of money, the closure of markets, and African governments have got other priorities, including personal gain, they're leaving a massive space for external funding to come in and re-exert the original system. And that's allowing the big NGOs have captured the development money. About 20 years ago, had ICDPs, Integrated Conservation Development Projects. That was basically a move by WWF and CI to grab development money to shift to conservation. So we now have, I think, with this 30 by 30, we've got if they want to conserve 30% of the planet, it's not going to come for free. And so we've got a situation now where there's a decision point. Do we do inclusive? Do we do exclusionary? Do we conserve 30% of the planet through exclusionary or inclusive conservation? And who gets the money? Do we keep going through the typical NGO service provider model, where I give money to NGO 1 and he goes or she goes and works with the community, and 50% of the money stays in Washington and 40% stays in Harare and 10% gets to the community? Or maybe we should be trying something like Andrew Yang's minimum guaranteed basic income and giving the money directly back to communities following certain procedures. So I think we're at a major tipping point if we're going to conserve wildlife. So now let's get real again. I had a meeting with the Community Leaders Network in Southern Africa yesterday or the day before. So the communities in Southern Africa and East Africa are getting organized because they see this happening. And they have associations at regional and national level. And they go to these international meetings, fight for their rights. They fight to trade, they fight to keep hunting open, etc. So they're very effective politically. What they aren't effective is delivering on the ground. They don't have technical effectiveness, because this is provided by the NGOs, who frankly are not effective either. So what I'm seeing is there's going to be a demand emerging for what's called ESG credits. Environment, social, and governance credits. So if communities look after environment, people are benefiting, the governance is good, there's money. I'm seeing this coming up in the development literature. But how do we make sure that that money gets to the right place, and how do we change the system? And this is where I see we have the ability to do the research and training, to empower all these communities with the sort of things that I've talked about, but in much more simple. I actually don't know how to be more simple. They actually understand it better than most of us. So therefore, I'm thinking, how do I influence that? And can I do it through knowledge and teaching? A few years ago, I put up this diagram. I analyzed one of the South African Journal of Wildlife Management. And what you can see is most of the article, it's supposed to be the most practical journal in South Africa. 91% of the articles are ecological, 9% are economics, and 0% are governance. But what's turning the system around is economics and governance. So here's a massive opportunity for us to provide the sort of things that I've been talking to you about. Do you remember Hilary Smith? Anyone remember Hilary Smith? She wrote a great paper. It's actually a very good paper called Hunting for Common Ground Between Wildlife Governments and Common Scholarship. And she said that commons knowledge is seldom applied in the real world. So there's all this great theory about ostrom, etc., but nobody applies it. And I thought about that, and I actually reviewed that paper. I thought, that's not correct. But she is correct in one way, in that in all the donors and the NGOs are not using that knowledge. But she's incorrect because this knowledge is actually being applied at local level. So what did Ostrom study? It hadn't been done. She studied case studies. And here's a quote from, this is my mentor, Marshall Mercury. He said, effective community-based natural resource management programs incorporate considerable commons knowledge. This was in 2001 in this book, yeah? The invisibility of this body of publications by scholar practitioners involved in community conservation is an important issue, worthy of analysis in itself. So I thought about that. And then I realized that in my lifetime, I played a major role bringing practitioners together to publish a bunch of books based on their experience. So that's the one I recently published through the IECN specialist group. We did those. Murphy and others did those. So there's knowledge out there, but you never see this knowledge quoted because it's not in the academic journals, and the practical people can't read journals, don't want to. So then I thought there's a real opportunity to get this knowledge into the workplace again, because the guys that most of the people that wrote these are now 70. I'm the youngest. So a lot of them are 70 years old, 80 years old, the people that actually did the work. So and it doesn't only go into books, it's going into legislation at the national level, at the local level, and even at the global level. If you look at the CBD sustainable use principles, they come very much out of this group. So the knowledge is there, but it's being forgotten. So that gives me a major opportunity. So the way I'm thinking of addressing it is, I do log frames. Does anyone else do log frames? You probably do log frames. So you have a long-term goal and a medium-term goal, and then you have major activities. So I'm going to talk about training leaders in conservation, economic research, and training communities. I'm just going to talk about those three. In Southern Africa, our goal is to go from a $2 to $3 billion wildlife economy to a $30 billion wildlife economy in the next 15 to 20 years. Because you saw that curve, there's so much variability. If we up the variability, many areas are earning $1 per hectare. Other areas are earning $40 per hectare from the same area. So what's stopping us going from 1 to 40? And that'll obviously help communities and so on. So the first strategy that I'm doing is putting together online training and field training in the form of a certificate in economy, governance, and community with these 4 courses. So 1 is inclusive governance. What is it? 2 is how do we get communities to work? 3 is how do we make money out of wildlife and how do we evaluate? Like Alex's stuff on how much money does Kruger make and how many jobs does it create and so on. And 4th is management. You're our class. We've been evaluating protected areas for 15 years in this class and case study. We still got to find one with a clear objective and with clear performance criteria. Globally, we had one from New Zealand. I think at last we got one that's got proper. No. So conservation is really badly managed. And so what I've got at the moment in my class is, these are the people. So I've got 3 guys from Northern Rangeland Trust working in community conservation in Kenya, 3 and Nature Conservancy. So Nature Conservancy is funding these guys, and they work in the Serengeti. Got a guy in Congo who's yet to pitch up. I've got a very good Malawian community guy, a community guy from Luangwa who rides his motorbike through the buffalo every morning, the organizer of the community forum in Zambia, 2 academics from Mozambique, 2 senior government officials from Mozambique who write policy, and 2 people from NGOs. This guy actually did all the land delimitation programs in Mozambique, so he's pretty hotshot. I've got a person from the ministry that manages the Jeff project in Zimbabwe. I've got the lady who's in charge of Zimbabwe elephant policy, and I've got a guy who works in a community that I started working with 30, 40 years ago. Scary, isn't it? Bunch of people from communities around the Delta in Botswana, 2 senior officials from Namibia, an academic and a private sector, and I got 4 from South Africa being cut off. Sorry, South Africa. And quite amazingly, we talk right across the continent. This is what these are the guys that were in the meeting this morning. And the debate, I don't know, Vincent, what do you think? But the debate is very high level, higher level probably, or as high a level as I have in the classroom, because this is their life. And what I'm expecting is that some of these people are going to start changing policy. Particularly, I'm targeting the Mozambicans, these guys, because they have, the industry is worth 10 million, it should be worth 200 to 500. They got 24 million hectares of community land that could do wildlife. So there's enormous potential there. The second thing, which I haven't started doing, is so that's that's kind of the leadership level. There's also the implementation of community. So this is how I do it. So you go in an area, you evaluate economically, governance, does it work? And then the sort of thing Leandra did, you do what I call a situation analysis, social mapping, livelihood surveys, governance surveys, what's happening in the community. And then there's the actual implementation. How do you make money? How do you govern a community? How do you manage natural resources? How do you monitor? How do you manage fire? WWF is good at that. Security and safety. And then there's managing the program. Now, what we have is a lot of people in Africa doing this work with no system for qualifications, no system for accreditation, no system for quality control. And so the Community Leaders Network is really interested in setting up an accreditation system for 2 things. One, often the manager is hired by the chief and his relative and is really useless. So how do we get rid of those people? And secondly, how do we give people a career trajectory so that they can develop their skills over time and get promoted? So I can do this, I can do this, I can, therefore I get promoted, I do this. So over the last 35 years, I've got a bunch of tools that I've been training communities with. In TR's conceptual, how to do situation analysis, livelihood survey, governance survey, how to do governance, how to monitor. So we've got a whole bunch of tools. And what I'm hoping is one day I can hire Leandra, who can help me put this together. And then that's just more of them. This is northern Mozambique. We need to have a site where we apply this properly. So I'm talking to Luwiri Conservancy about maybe putting students there so we can run a proper system that can become a demonstration site over the next 10 years. So as we put in proper systems, other people can come and see them and we can test them, but also you're experimenting. Is the social capital going? If you put in this kind of governance, does the social capital really do this or does it actually do that? And so by implementing, we really can run an adaptive experiment. So doesn't that look nice? It's bloody hot there, it's 42 degrees. So there's a picture of our northern, I want to stop there. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of doing. And with you guys, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I wasn't really talking to the.
All right. Questions for Brian? I'm going to start with the live audience because he has people on the screen.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Brian, I've been watching you for a few years, and I think you're just doing some fantastically important stuff. And even with your leadership, you're a platoon fighting the big army. All the literature I get from CR Club and World Wildlife Fund is exclusionary, almost across the board, with a little bit of nibbling around the edges. What's the biggest barrier to having an influence in that world? You're running up.
That's a really good question, Mike. I was asked that in my class today. Where's the literature? I'm doing all this stuff. Where's the literature? Because I write it, but there's not a lot of other people doing it. So maybe it's up to you guys. I don't know. I'd love to know what the answer is, Mike, because the whole literature is this way, and it's not working. In fact, we're getting narrower and narrower and more compartmentalized over the years. If you think of what most wildlife managers were 30 years ago, they were, I think, more holistic. Now we're much more specialized. So we're much better at the small stuff, but we're not getting the big picture. I don't have the answer to your question. It's a very good
If
one.
you do, you know what to do.
Yeah. Has anyone got the answer to that question?
No, sorry.
Aaron puts his hand out very quickly.
Yeah. Go ahead, Aaron.
To go from a very big, broad, important question to something much more particular, most of the literature that is out there, most of the conversation, is mostly today was talking about sort of, in terms of the particular sort of economic uses, right? Trophy hunting and ecotourism, but meat that seems to be really important equation for like social capital and for the development of domestic markets and the way that coheres people. And so I wasn't sure to what extent there's a lot of work looking at that, looking at the sort of the use of meat in sort of local markets, being critical for fostering a sense of ownership, a sense of self-determination, because oftentimes, of course, meat is not sort of legally used by communities. So I wasn't sure if there's a lot of literature about that, or if you.
That's really interesting. There's a lot of literature on meat production and how it's declining the wildlife in the forests and how dependent people are on it. There's what are these CGIAR, these global research groups. There's a big meat production group. I just actually had a paper accepted yesterday about exactly this governance stuff, because they're not talking about governance. There's no talk about governance, which is amazing. It's talking about how do you harvest, how do you do this, how do you do that, how do you stop the trade, but nothing about ownership or nothing about organizing communities, which is really quite shocking. So we need to have these challenging questions.
How do you explain the difference between Kenya and Southern Africa in terms of conservation policy?
That's also another interesting question. I don't really know, but I think it's the balance of, I think it's how much money there is in the international NGOs versus in the local system. So Kenya is very dominated, so what happened in Kenya? Kenya was at the front of the stuff in the 60s, and then they had independence, and Madam Kenyatta got involved with a lot of ivory trade. And so the Wildlife Agency completely collapsed, and it was all filled in by Western NGOs. And so that culture has now continued. Whereas Southern Africa, I think the culture of the wildlife organization is much more like America. It's linked to landholders, hunting, national parks. And I think that's why the areas are so different. It's a really interesting research question. And what about West Africa? I've got a student from West Africa now, and that's part of the remit to figure that out and connect to it. Is anyone online that wants to ask?
Anyone online that wants to ask a question?
Anyone awake online?
May I have a question?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Chai. Very interesting presentation. I have a question. We all know that it is very difficult to implement the project in regions where people are poor and they don't have enough meat for daily meal. So what are the lessons learned to overcome these difficulties from the beginning of project to get people involved? Thank you.
I think the leaders are, judging from the people in my class, there's incredible passion to sort out the problems. I don't know what you guys, anyone been in the, I think these people want to sort their own problems out. They're tired of waiting for outsiders to not sort their problems out. And at the real local level, they're kind of disillusioned with the world, like the talk we had from Honduras.
Last week, Becky Williams. Yeah.
At the very low level, I think there's a great danger of Africans their lives becoming meaningless, and this obviously happened. But in the leadership level, there's a lot of passion. In Zimbabwe, even this week, they're changing the legislation. And that's coming from somewhere. These guys are not sitting around doing nothing. I think there's enormous talent in Africa. And that's what I'm tapping into.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
Sure. We're at 3:50. So thank you very much, Brian. You now get a break.